I am pleased to introduce Mr. Aaron Mair as our keynote speaker. That will be followed by a Q&A moderated by Maria Bulatova, FISU Education Committee member representing Ukraine. Happy to have both of you all here today. We'll bring you up in just a second. So Aaron is currently the Adirondack Wilderness Campaign Director for the Adirondack Council. He is the former president of the Sierra Club and an environmental justice pioneer, intersectionally working in the spaces of health, environment, voting rights, and disparities over the last 40 years. He is a 35-year veteran urban environmental activist, regional and national environmental justice organizer, and strategist from the state of New York. Would you please welcome to the stage Mr. Aaron Mair.
Good morning, everybody. It is indeed an honor to be here, and as they say, be blessed with the opportunity to address a global audience when it comes to talking about climate, justice, environment, and its actual impacts even upon a season. I promise there will be a winter piece in this talk, but a couple of things, if you know anything about me, I check that box, but then I divert to the real issues at hand. I will probably be a little bit more forceful than some of the speakers yesterday who I felt, they want to more or less bring people along, which has been the traditional modality of getting people involved in the climate movement. But I want to convey the sense of urgency, so my talk will be basically a little bit more leaning in. The language will be strong, but it will be truthful. It'll be honest, it'll be candid. Brother Bill McKibben touched upon some of the intersectional components with regards to race, politics, and civil society. I will probably be delving into those a little bit deeper. But I want to talk a little bit about who I am. I am Aaron Mair, as mentioned, the Wilderness Campaign Director for the Adirondack Council. For some folks, that was an interesting hire. They're saying, why are you up in the Adirondacks? You're an EJ activist. And if anybody knows anything about the environmental movement, the environment doesn't know color, politics, race, or creed. It is the environment, and you're an activist, and that is to your core and to your being. Bill did something very interesting yesterday, and also quite intentional. And one of the things that are critical to movement building is acknowledging some of those who are in the room with you, those local activists, people like Naj Wyckoff, who's in the room. I see that's there, some of the various other activists who I've interacted with. And it's important because lifting up those voices, it's those voices that are in the field and on the ground, in the religious faith community, in the social justice community, just in basic civics community, that do make this movement, as I say, significant and impactful where the rubber meets the road, which is the average citizen. But equally and more importantly, because we are in the fight against climate change, the point of building a diverse and inclusive movement is very, very critical. And this is why the FISU Games or the Olympics are very critical platforms by which we need to lean into. You heard talks yesterday who talked about the spirit of the sports, and we don't want to detract from that. But actually, sports have often been the point of change in highlighting the need and urgency. Whether it was in the Munich Games at the rise of the evil that we saw that began through World War II, and how the diversity of the American delegation with Jesse Owens struck down the notions and myths behind the master race theory. Black and Jewish athletes and runners on the American team exemplified the power of diversity in sport, through sport, to bring about change. And that is also true here at these games. We're at an intersectional moment, an opportunity in time, where we not only talk about the games, but we get to talk about the climate crisis, because now we're going to see winter sports, a whole sector of athleticism, potentially disappear over the next 20 years, or venues, as mentioned yesterday in the scholarship outline yesterday, will decrease to only a handful, literally a handful. The crisis is real. And these athletes, not only do we celebrate their achievements as we do all athletes, but we also want to highlight the moment of what is real and what is at risk. Why? Because the politics of denial, even coming from our national government, while on one level America leads on climate activism, but on another level it destabilizes the whole global conversation on climate activism. And so Bill's acknowledgments and lifting up various actors and leaders was very critical. The land acknowledgments of reminding us who was here before, the stewardship of the Mohawk Nation, this is their lands, it's always been their lands, it will always be their lands. That's very critical because again, it tells us about this unique place in space. But it also reminds us of their stewardship and their partnership and their leadership, because folks looked at the acknowledgement at the opening of the games or even at the opening of the speaking series as if it's, you know, a box to check. But the Mohawk Nation is a business partner that is bringing economic opportunity for those who currently work and live in this land. Champlain-Hudson Power Express is a combination of First Nation as well as private sector with regards to Champlain Hydro-Quebec. In that partnership, not only tackling climate change and dealing in renewable and clean energy, but bringing that opportunity throughout internationally, but throughout the region. And I want to lift that up because if only thing you think about sports, and just say, well, okay, yeah, we think that FISU, they did the first climate-friendly games and the torch wasn't lit. You know, some people nowadays, the conversation about burning stuff, as Bill talked about, is a big thing. And the fact that we're transitioning to clean energy is a critical thing, but it's more than a footnote. That partnership symbolizes the future. The First Nations were first, but they are also part of the solution to the future. So that land acknowledgement, but also clean energy acknowledgement needs to be highlighted and made a note of. And hold that in your minds and in your heart, because again, it's about all of us coming together, and I will be talking about that in my talk, and building a movement on a sustainable future. Next slide, please. But again, looking at FISU, you know, as an economic opportunity, without looking at it as being a spark of inclusive action and action toward climate change in a holistic way that it lifts all boats, would be a mistake. Moreover, the bigotries of evil, exclusion, denial, as Bill lifted up yesterday, and those threats and risks that are right now coming through the current worst actions with regards to burning fossil fuels that put frontline communities, and mostly communities of color, at risk, communities that contributed the least to climate change but bearing the worst impacts, is something that we must all work to reverse. And hopefully my conversation today will move us in a direction, and at least thoughts, hearts, and mind, to build that inclusive movement, but more importantly, understand why we must build that inclusive movement so that we can take much more decisive action. I will talk more globally on how we need to act locally to build this inclusive movement. And FISU is both an important opportunity for engagement, education, mobilization, and action. And so you'll see a QR code on some of my slides. And so I think that QR code, hopefully if it's a high resolution digital content, hopefully folks will be able to scan that on their local computers at home. But still, it's not about just the talk, it's about engagement and enlisting you to action. And because of the urgency, my talk, again, and I'm not apologizing, but I speak in my true voice, is so that forcefulness is to convey the sense that we must act. It's not desperation. As Bill pointed out, we, instead of having 40 years, a 40-year runway to act since Kyoto, we have about 5 years to act, to change some of the most worst effects of climate change. Let's be clear. Some of the mild effects are happening now. The opening of this year, we are facing over 100 deaths that are related. This is 2023 in the United States, from Buffalo to California, due to weather and climate disruption related events. And so with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about me and the Forever Adirondacks campaign that I lead. A little bit about me: I'm one of the handful of African American wilderness climate experts in the country. And the opportunity to come and work within the Adirondacks was not economic, was not because I have a lot of great environmental activist friends and leaders in the Adirondacks. It's because Adirondacks is right now the most critical frontier with regards to fighting the worst effects of climate change. I use the term that the Adirondacks are the lungs of New York. And hopefully through global collaboration and cooperation, if we are ever to witness the Algonquin in Canada to Adirondacks wildlife corridor, it will be the largest wilderness lung, as they say, in the world, and a model for carbon sequestration. The Forever Adirondack campaign right now, it is a campaign, meaning short duration and action, but it's to mobilize as many Americans and global actors and leaders to take up the battle of wilderness protection and wilderness carbon sinks. And we do that through three methodologies. One is protecting, the wilderness and the forest. This is one of the most unique wilderness ecosystems. You've heard yesterday of the number of national parks that you can fit inside of the Adirondacks. Well, let me throw in a state. You can fit the state of Vermont inside of the Adirondacks as a point, a mental placeholder. But that wilderness, and it's a mixed use, it's some in private holdings and the other half in state holdings, but it is a model of collaboration. Sure, there are tensions about it because people are very protective of land use and rights, but the point being is that the laws, the constitutional laws that set up this unique region, the blue line, make it a model. The intent was to preserve wilderness. That was the initial intent. Wilderness for wilderness' sake. Wilderness for the enjoyment and shareholdership of all of us. But let me be clear. This investment was an investment by New York for all New Yorkers. I've heard some people, in fact, some of the folks from Chippy Hydro-Quebec have actually, as part of their faith to the community, have moved here, which is great. And folks, they were regaled with the argument, well, you can't call yourself really, from the park. You're still kind of like an outsider. Let me be clear. There can be no outsider to the Adirondack Park. In fact, every New Yorker, and I am a shareholder. These public lands, by the right of the Constitution and our investments, belong to all of us. Now, I may not hold a private home, or a summer home, or a camping hut, or a hunting hut, or a ski-doo hut, but I am nonetheless a shareholder in the Adirondacks. This is all New Yorkers' land, all New Yorkers' park. There is no insider or outsider. You may reside here. Your proximity, if you're blessed to be here and enjoy it daily, but it is for the enjoyment of all New Yorkers. But our mighty Adirondacks also now faces a new test and a new opportunity. And this relationship with FISU, Hydro-Quebec, with Chippy, with the Champaign-Hudson Power Express, bringing the largest amount of clean energy, stable clean energy to the city of New York, is now part of that front line, as I say, benefit, but also part of the clean energy solution. And the other part, they're talking about hydro energy as one, as I say, reliable source, but the other issue is that of carbon capture and storage. Nature is the oldest, largest natural carbon capture storage thing that we have. And the Adirondacks represents that powerful asset. Protecting the Adirondacks and investing in the Adirondacks is investing in the fight against climate change. We need not do less, we must do more. Next slide, please. So, my winter piece before I pivot. The two slides that you see there, because I think I was inspired yesterday by the speaker yesterday who talked about showing his legacy and connection. And back in the 90s, there was a program through ORDA that worked on bringing youth in underserved communities to enjoy winter sports. It was one of those early diversity efforts. I don't think it was called diversity, but it was basically expanding that opportunity. And half of my ancestry is Jamaican. So naturally, as a Jamaican, I told my daughters, listen, let's go do the bobsled. So those are 3 of my 4 daughters. The oldest 2, Marjana and Heba, in the bobsled. And that's Heba and Mariam after a bobsled run because they did about 6 runs that day. And think about it. Kids going from the age of 9 through 12, just enjoying the winter sport in the outdoor, and more importantly, being part of it and having that bigger experience. That exposure was very significant and meaningful in their lives. Now, I've dragged them to countless environmental activist actions throughout their lives. In fact, the oldest one, she was a very significant student activist leader in the fight to clean up the Hudson from polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs. She organized hundreds of students from the capital region to speak at hearings, and she used that as her leadership essay for the United States Military Academy. But the point being is that the winter that they knew, which was that activity was like right about right now in January. It was actually during the winter break, during the Christmas season. But that level of snow at Christmas time in the Adirondacks was not here. Was not here. So within that short window of opportunity that they had, we're witnessing serious impacts. But there's another impact. The program that they had, and the reason why I'm talking about this wonderful program, because I got my brother Joe Martens in the audience. And Joe Martens knows of a couple of points. Not only is he head of ORDA, but to say, here are programs. We talk about opportunities to build a diverse and inclusive movement, but also opportunity for all New Yorkers. That this is not an elite or reserved for whites. In fact, one of the good things about watching the teams march in, you get to see a stratification of who actually engages, and you can start to see some nations, they do have, interesting interests. But, again, we saw Haiti there. To me, I was inspired by that. But the fact of the matter is, there could be countless more communities of color participating in the winter sports if the state of New York restarts its program that allows all New Yorkers to engage in this. One of the things I love about working and collaborating with the folks from Hydro-Quebec on Chippy was the engagement of frontline communities in the metropolitan area. The first places where the torch landed was the 5 boroughs. Now, what's missing from the slide here, because I thought about it this month, I miss the youth of color in the metro area carrying the torch, in from, I believe it was Italy, into the United States. But again, we have the rush for the games, but we don't want to lose sight of what the games are doing. It's stimulating interest and impact. And if we had, I would say, about 150 youth of the 5 boroughs, that 150 youth could be the feeders of programs and opportunity, but also future athletes for the state of New York. But they're also future climate activists. And they have a right to enjoy this wonderful place. But even as we're right now worrying about winter, we still want to engage them, because what better way to educate all New Yorkers about the impacts of climate and educate them early when we have programs like this. So hopefully the conversation and the idea, because you get to see, you saw it here, we did at once in order have a program. You don't have to do what I call tokenism. You have to just engage. This is what movement building is about. It's about engagement and meeting people where they are. The other is that of representation and having diverse voices and power and place in space. Next slide, please. And so you often heard yesterday about the legacy and the history of the Adirondacks. And you heard it from the perspective of the Olympics of the 30s and the Olympics of the 80s. And you may, again, going back to the land acknowledgement, the First Nations who were here before. But that is such an incomplete history. Part of the investment in these games is also a conversation in the investment in diversity and why the power of diversity pays off. You see there an important arc of history here, but before this, there was another nation, as I say, the First Nations. We talk about the First Nation land acknowledgement, the First Nations. Anybody know what the First Nations were? Enslaved Africans who were brought to build and fight for in the American Revolution and create what is now American United States. And during the late part of the 18th century to the early part of the 19th century, throughout New England, they acknowledged free people of color and gave them the right to vote, all except New York State. In the early part of the 19th century, they also engaged in actions that resulted in blacks being taken off the streets. So folks ever saw the movie 12 Years a Slave about Solomon Northup, a person of color, a free African who lived in the Adirondacks, taken off the streets of New York. And what's powerful about his first-person story and narrative, it's a window into the 19th century, how people of color literally feared for their safety in walking the streets because they could be snatched off the streets and sold into slavery. And because they were blacks in chains, people then, like now, assumed they did something wrong and nobody intervened. But this is what's very powerful about Solomon Northup's story, was that it highlighted and was a preamble to a black suffrage fight for voting rights, the first in this nation. It wasn't the South, it wasn't at the Civil War, but the first fight for suffrage and voting rights to get human rights, citizens' rights, was here in the state of New York. Here, the settlements were up in the Adirondacks. And at that time, there was two places in the early part of the 19th century called Timbuktu. One was in West Africa. The other is now in a place called Lake Placid, North Elba, but this is where the other Timbuktu in the early part of the 19th century was. This was part of a scheme to give blacks, over 3,000 folks, the right to vote. There were about 12, a dozen of these settlements right here in the high peaks in the Adirondacks. Now, if you know about Mao Zedong and his great retreat to the mountains, and as they say, in the safety of the mountains and the high peaks, because they formed a natural geographic barrier against slave hunters and people who are willing to take blacks off the street like Solomon Northup, well, that's why the high peaks was a critical place. Now, granted, there was a farming scheme that didn't work out, but that's not what it was about. The scheme was about the right to vote. The Adirondacks to the First Nations was the first fight in a blow that would build the civil rights, ultimately the Civil War, but eventually that long struggle to be equal citizens in the United States. And the Adirondacks was that headwater for our community and our movement. But that's not enough. We talked about how they set in the Constitution the constitutional amendment that created the Adirondacks. But in the 1960s, when they were still fighting over what the Forever Wild Clause, and a lot of other interests wanted to get rid of the Forever Wild Clause, a woman from Brooklyn, New York, Dolly Lothier Robinson. So Dolly Robinson, you would know more about her had she won Congress, because the person that she ran for Congress against was called Shirley Chisholm. Shirley Chisholm, because she's the first African woman to go to Congress, got that higher flame. But Dolly was the voice of reason and the voice of power that led to the protection of the Forever Wild Clause in the Adirondacks, in the Adirondacks that we enjoy today in the blue line. You know, it was her Patrick Henry moment of give me liberty or give me death, but give me this wonderful ecology, because my people, all New Yorkers, have a right. And prophetically, she says, while I may not in my lifetime make it here, I want to make sure that all of my people, all my community, all of New Yorkers have the right to enjoy this unique asset. African-American woman, leader, visionary, and yet no monument, no marker, but a very significant voice. And fast forward it to today, when we have the first African-American woman, Benita Lawjal, who's sitting right down here in front, who we fought for to get her on the Adirondack Park Agency to carry forward the mandate, the voice, the passion, and love of equity and inclusion. Now, it's interesting because when she came on board, again, we talk about in saving the environmental movement, we talk about the Adirondacks, we talk about the climate movement. One of the things that Bill talked about was how race is always at the bottom. So rather than just simply the welcoming and acknowledgement of we got another wonderful leader to the Adirondack Park Agency board. And again, people started getting into, well, what's her qualification? Well, people don't realize a lot of people's qualification, at least for half the poll, you have to do is be a resident geographically in the park, okay? And for a park that's supposed to be a benefit and an asset to all, if the majority of the population is not people of color, then you can imagine what the board looked like. So it was not representative, and then the interest, because it was not representative, was stereotypical to the needs of only the interests of only a faction of a few whose vision of the park was antithetical to the park's existence. So having Benita there was a very significant milestone, because what they did not, had they about to look up, they will find that she not only is a public health professional, nutritionist, has her master's degree, I believe, in nutrition. She has fought for heart-healthy activities because one of the most chronic diseases leading to death is heart disease and diabetes in the Black and Hispanic, but also throughout America. But we have a crisis in the Black and Hispanic community, so her hiking and outdoor activities, walking the walk, and then enjoying and being a passionate lover of nature, she has fused her profession at an innovative level with the environment, and then through her own activism and out of her own pocket, financing buses, transportation of getting people from New York City, Buffalo, Syracuse, all over to the Adirondacks, as well as other green and open spaces. I lift her up. Bill dropped my name several times, but I was embarrassed because there are lots of other people in the room who are unsung. But more importantly, whose work are building a diversified and equitable movement, not for themselves, okay? Not for the Black community, but for all New Yorkers. And because she was appointed, I want to lift up the other ugly sides. Because one of the comments was, well, we know, look at her, we know why she was appointed. It was not her Blackness. In fact, for those who dare raise that argument, she has more qualifications as an outings leader, as a hiker, as a lover of nature, than a number of the folks that are sitting there. Some of them, because of their factional politics, don't believe in Article 14. But you have a person of color, it's to her core. But more importantly, the fact that the wilderness and the love of the outdoors, clean air, and the environment saves lives. It's a public health good. You know, that's what makes her a powerful voice. And not only that, walking in the trail of Dolly Robinson. It's not that her appointment is a token appointment, it's a necessary appointment. It is a just appointment. It is in the arc of the history that goes back when this was a Black suffrage settlement, before it was Lake Placid or an Olympic Village. It was the village of her people, of her ancestors. So her place in right and defense, following in the path of Dolly Robinson, is an act of consistency. And we must do more, because why? We are stronger and we are more powerful for it. Getting more New Yorkers to this place in this space is an economic benefit, because it puts heads on beds. That's where you get hotels, people come, there's tourists. and they enjoy it, but you got to create that welcoming place and space. Having people of color on the APA board ensures not only equity and access, but also, when we talk about equal protection under the law, justice, having them there, those side conversations of exclusion and injustice must vacate and leave the room. Next slide. And why is that important? Not only did we have the worst effects of climate change hit and lead off this year in the Adirondacks, we talk about creating a safe place and space. And we talk about when forced nations who are here, who fought for their freedom, who had to fight for voting rights, Dolly Lother Robinson, who laid down her voice in advocacy and protection of this great wilderness, and Benita Lord Zhao, who's brought thousands of New Yorkers of diverse backgrounds to this park. And yet, it still is not safe for a person of color. So why FISU? At a point in which the global community has its eyes on America, its eyes on New York, its eyes on the loss of snow, it must also have its eyes that we're still struggling, like other parts of the world, against right-wing tendencies of exclusion, of destruction, of harm, of hurt. When a child can't go to school and be safe, nobody can. It's more than just winter, because that hate drives the denial. It drives the failure in our democracy. It drives the failure in civil societies, where right-wing elements feel that they can overthrow people, systems, cultures for their interests. And this is January 6th. Lead off. That was my New Year's welcome. The reminder that, yes, I'm an environmentalist. Yes, I work for the Adirondack Council. Yes, I'm passionate about saving humanity. But my race and my dignity matters. Excuse me. Next slide, please. So why am I here? This is an old fight for me. This is a long fight for me. It's been my avocation, my vocation as spatial epidemiologist. I'm an epidemiologist. I do disease maps. I'm retired from doing that for the state of health, the New York State Department of Health. And always that parallel life was also that of an environmental activist. So how did I come into environmental activism? I came in the mid-'80s when the United States was facing a solid waste crisis. And somebody thought a state-of-the-art, environmentally sound solution was to set garbage on fire. As Bill say, we have a culture that likes to burn stuff. Right? Clean energy, free energy, clean power to power the entire New York State government process. So our judicial governor's mansion, our government capitol building, our legislative office building, as well as the Empire State Plaza, all fun, what they called then state-of-the-art, as they say, clean energy. In the 70s they're talking about. But it wasn't. It was burning garbage. It was burning solid waste. Now this is what we call a negative amenity. There's positive amenities, right? There are parks. Government invests and buys parks, buy land for land protection. Well, one of the things we found in 1987 when they did a study is that when they do positive amenity, land acquisition, open space, green space, land conservancy, these then tend to fall out or fall amongst or accrue to mainly white areas. But the negative amenities that are also necessary for society, like sewage treatment plants, bus depots, bus stations, garbage plants, they get cited in communities of color. In 1987, the Toxic Waste and Race Study was pioneered by the faith community, United Church of Christ in New York City, under Dr. Benjamin Chavis, who had a very powerful, diverse lead, Charles Lee, of Chinese descent, Asian descent, Vernice Miller Travis, Caribbean descent. They did the first pioneering scientific analysis of pollution, impacts, how things are cited, who bears the burden. Because up until then, there were court cases. But because most of the evidence was not scientific but anecdotal, the communities, the frontline communities, lost. And this is what inspired that pioneering study. In that study, one of the cases is that of Arbor Hill and the Albany solid waste incinerator. I was brought into this movement, and Bonita hears me ramble on about this many a time, not because I was an environmental activist. I love the outdoors. I grew up, born and raised in Peekskill, New York, grew up in the Hudson River Valley. Avid angler, sportsman, hunter, loved the outdoors, but I was not active in the sense for a purpose, for people, for humanity, until it hit my front door. The incinerator, I happened, as I said, the Lord, within the black community, we said, the Lord doesn't put you in a place, a space, if he did not have an intention or purpose. This is that faith side. And could have moved to Clifton Park, could have been, any of the suburbs. But I felt a strong need to give back because I was raised that way. Son of a UAW labor rights organizer, World War II vet. And so I felt my give back was to live in the black community, build a home there, build it near a park, and build it right near a middle school. And that would be my give back. And I could engage the community from a petty bourgeois existence. But I happened to be in the prevailing wind pattern of the Answers incinerator. Long and story short, my daughters developed something called environmental asthma. We all have potential risk of cancer, asthma, but the question is, what is your chronic exposure? What's your threshold? We're all like litmus paper. Depending upon how much chronic exposure and dosage, you can then trigger the symptoms. You can get the cancers, et cetera. You already may genetically have the risk, but it's the environmental exposure and trigger that turns it on outside of genetic factors. In this particular case, I don't have asthma in my family, nor did I have asthma in my wife's side of the family. But nonetheless, my daughters, because of chronic exposure to incomplete and uncombusted byproducts from that incinerator, were amongst the many children in that community of over 15,000 that were impacted by this. By the way, this is when I met Brother Yusuf in the field, okay, when we organized. And we collected the data. And I had to apply my skill as a biostatistician to go out in the field to collect that data and see what that pattern was, and then trying to find the source and see what the commonality, et cetera. But we traced it to that incinerator. And that's what I committed, what I call career suicide, but also launched a new career. Career suicide is if you're a state worker, you want to rise up through the ranks, you got to please your bosses all the way up to the governor. And I knew that in taking on that incinerator and exposing the harm that was done, because this was a poor, desperate black community, that the liability lied at the foot of the state. And then I also would have to go up against my fellow scientists at the health department to fight this battle. We did fight, and we did win. And that's a significant piece of grassroots organizing and action, but we did not do it alone. We did it by movement building, something I learned as a civil rights, voting rights activist. You take on a 10,000-pound gorilla, you have to scale up. You have to scale up and bring in other allies. That's when I learned about the Sierra Club in the 80s. And it was from that connection that I said, I'm going to work through this organization. But a little quick backstory. When I went to the Sierra Club and talked about solid waste and the needs to build a solid waste movement at a time when solid waste and the garbage barge, if any of you are old enough to remember the garbage barge in the 80s, the late 80s, how New York City, when they closed what Fresh Kills landfill, they had no place to send their garbage, and nobody wanted it. And so the garbage barge went up and down the eastern seaboard, but ultimately, like again, true to the environmental justice principles, dumped in a third world nation, ultimately. But in this instance, they burned it, and they decided in our community, but like I said, I had to fight and push back. So when building the allyship with the Sierra Club and doing that presentation with them, the first question that folks asked me coming in, did you go to the NAACP? Not whether the environmental impacts or the solid waste issue that many whites were already acting on, But because a person of color came in the room and asked for allyship and solidarity, I wasn't asking for a handout. I was asking for the technology and skill to mobilize and organize a community, because that's what they were good at. I went to the experts. But because of my race, it mattered. It walked in the room, and I got the separate and unequal treatment. That gentleman, Roger Gray, who's also from who has property here in the Adirondacks. Every now and then I crash at his place in Silver Lake. He was the one reduced to tears and outraged and apologized on a drive back from New York City all the way back to Albany profusely. And I thanked him and I said, listen, it's not on you. It's their loss, but we will figure out a way. Roger Gray showed up 3 days later, because him and another activist who was an artist, because the movement is of everybody. It's not just, people got various passions. So one of the artists within the Sierra Club from the Capital Region and Roger made that sign with the incinerator, a woman of color with an umbrella protecting her child. I was touched and moved that even despite the hate, others rose above it to network and build, and as they say, the first $250 to the fight against the Answers incinerator came from the white community. And I made a pledge to him that once we were successful with the Answers incinerator, I will join the Sierra Club. And I will join the Sierra Club not because the Sierra Club did good, but join the Sierra Club so it can realize its mission of including all humanity to save humanity and to save and protect the environment, not for a few, but for all of us. And that's how I ended up becoming a member of the Sierra Club. We did win. We won over $1 million in a federal RCRA action against the state of New York. We beat back, as I say, the state scientists, but that also launched my career actively following upon the work of Ben Chavis and them lifting up the environmental justice, need for environmental justice action and diversity in the environmental movement. I then pledged myself to absolutely building a massive, global, multi-ethnic, intergenerational, multiracial, irrespective of party, grassroots movement to protect humanity, to protect the environment. And I met up with numerous leaders from around the world, and we have been, as I say, engaged in that field. But the long and short of it is that global knowledge of almost 40 years that I bring in expertise to the Adirondacks and the Adirondacks wilderness movement. Not because I just love trees and I want to be the Lorax. And though I love the Lorax, I've read, it's a big story it's an intergenerational story with the kids. Because, as I say, you speak for the trees because they do not speak for themselves. So joining the Adirondack Council at a time when we are seeking to protect humanity and the globe from the worst effects of climate change, this was the next logical step in the wake of all my years and decades of participating in COP summits around the globe. Because the wilderness carbon sink was going to be better than any carbon capture storage initiative launched by the private sector that is seeking taxpayer dollars to fund the construction of carbon capture storage plants. The entities that are responsible for pumping out carbon, the petrochemical industry, okay, the carbon-based industry, they want taxpayer subsidies to pay for the carbon capture storage. And my big concern about the current IRA are the investments, and also the US pledges in investment. But not only must we fight against, as I say, those manufacturers' false solutions, but let the private sector that's polluting pay. The polluter should pay. That's one of the core bases and foundations of the Superfund. The polluter should pay. And I'm hoping that as we move forward with the CLCPA, that some of those leaders that here are within earshot or watching this, that they resurrect the notion that the investment in carbon capture storage, is one of the things. Boy, I am way behind. Next slide, real quick. So what does that mean? Stepping to the Adirondack Council, I am right now working with one of the most significant ecosystems that is the best carbon capture storage. We don't have to manufacture. It is already here. What we need to do is build the jobs and scale up the Green New Deal. Now, Green New Deal has been an abstract concept that means a lot of things to a lot of people. But like anything, we have with the leadership, Order, and other folks who are right here to create the green economy. Chippy is here. Not only do we talk about protecting and preserving the Adirondacks by having a clean source of energy flowing to New York, but also investment within this carbon sink. As I said, what's a carbon? Invest in expanding this. But also, it's not enough to expand a wilderness if you don't create the jobs of stewardship to manage it. That's the secondary piece. Now, in New York State, it gets caught up in the budget fight, and everybody's fighting over personnel, but this is a time where we can go big. The government at the federal level has launched a 30 by 30, protecting 30% of the nation's wilderness and forested areas by 2030. We should have the most aggressive lobbying front in Washington, D.C. to pay for that civil service as well as private sector jobs to make not only the 6 million acres manageable, but to expand it, to work toward that 30 by 30 to connect the Algonquin in Canada to the Adirondacks. We should be working internationally across borders with Canada to expand the lung of New York to make it the lung of North America. We have this opportunity. So evangelizing and walking in that place and space is one of the opportunities why I've taken this job, and I advocate for a natural carbon sink solution because this is the critical front line. I'm going. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Next slide. And it's not only just preserving it for the forest, and also, as you saw, my older daughters, this is my youngest daughter, she's now 15, and and she's there with Julia Gorins of the Adirondack Mountain Club's son. They're out on an outing, and this is, when we talk about healing and using nature to heal and build relationships, this is what it's all about. So not only do they enjoy the science and the wilderness and the outdoor, and by the way, like her sisters, she's an avid little climate activist, but she knows why she's there. Another generation and crop should be there. These FISU games in the Adirondacks is not only just about saving winter, but understanding and protecting this wilderness, and that its sequestering of carbon will actually try to mitigate some of the destabilizing effects of climate change. Next slide, please. And why? Because our nations, our globe's oceans and forests are the biggest sequesters of carbon. Okay? Think about that. We're not building our way out of carbon sequestration. The real investment is in those factors that are going to have the greatest impact. And now, obviously, we're not going to throw money into the sea, but we can expand protected areas within our oceans to allow for biodiversity to be protected, okay? But the thing that we can invest in is our carbon sinks. And the Adirondacks is one of the most critical pieces of infrastructure if we're talking about saving winter. Protecting the Adirondacks, protecting the Amazon, protecting the West African forest, protecting the forests and mangroves over in Indonesia are critical frontline assets and why we should be investing globally. We talked about the billions that UN had promised to deliver to the frontline nations who are bearing the worst effects but have some of the best assets. This is one of the assets that we can afford and we can fund. And why? Next slide, please. We saw how this winter began. When we talk about climate change, we heard yesterday climate destabilization. Up until about 15 years ago, we had still a significant polar vortex that was not so wobbly. As the globe heats up, as Bill pointed out and scientists pointed out yesterday, as more moisture is sucked up into the atmosphere, and as the polar vortex gets more destabilized, it pulls more heat into polar regions, both north and south, and it dumps more cold into non-polar regions. So you not only have weird snow events, but as you heard from, next slide, the various ocean river current storms, as well as, the warmest weather in Europe at this time of season where you're talking about the loss of your winter. Next slide. This is important because in 2015, I had an important debate with a gentleman called by the name of Ted Cruz, who's a senator in the United States, Congress. He's a US Senator. And he hung on the theory of climate pause. And his argument in climate pause was that the globe was not getting hotter, it was actually cooling. And that the ice in the poles was expanding. And so therefore, if you just look at the planet, you would see climate change is not really having an effect, an impact. But as Bill McKibben pointed out yesterday, yeah, that's not true. In fact, yes, you have, in some cases, certain seasons, more ice, because as I say, as ice packs, as I say, melt, there's more fresh water on the surface of the salt water, so it's going to freeze. So you may have more ice, but it's thin. You know, as he talked about the indigenous Americans who can no longer go out and fish because of the thin ice. But as that becomes part of the saline solution, you know, the poles are, as they say, the ice packs are getting smaller, but more importantly, the ocean is heating up. The ocean then becomes a major heat sink. More of it evaporates and it destabilizes the entire global climate. So we're having shorter winters like we have here in the Adirondacks. In the Adirondacks, we're facing almost 2 months, I think it's like 57, 56 days, of which we're going to be losing of winter. And we are experiencing that right now. When most athletes arrived here for the FISU games, they arrived in the rain. There was no snow. They see this in Europe and around the globe. Next slide. So the need to act is to build that global movement. And so with FISU is the opportunity to work on a movement that I've been working with indigenous tribes from across the nation and in the environmental justice movement. This is my brother Tom Gotooth. He's a Lakota Sioux. And one of the things is that recognizing that there needs to be a global climate agreement, but whereby we pull in all actors. So this, just like at COP, I see FISU and winter sports as being like the UN, whereby we pull together, next slide, and we build that movement. That's us in solidarity out at Standing Rock. One of the things when I became the president of the Sierra Club, this is when the power of position, when you're in the right position to do the right thing rather than selling out to corporate interests. When you're in a powerful position in government, you can either work for the people, work for humanity, or your kid gets an internship at Exxon or Shell and all of a sudden you're doing strange things. But when I was at the Sierra Club, I took that organization that once turned me away because I was of color, and that was not in the interest of certain environmental actors. I turned that into a bully pulpit and started investing in people of color movements all around the country and all around the globe. And one of my proudest major investments was the roadie, what I call a roadie. They're the people that set up the stage for the Dakota Access struggle. We financed the Dakota Access struggle under this African Americans' watch, so that our indigenous communities would, as they say, have a platform, but so that the world can bear witness to the consequences and the lopsided power that fossil fuels has in this country. My preparatory prayer for that meeting and that rally was praying at the grave of Lakota Sioux Chief Sitting Bull and remembering their contribution in struggle for their people and their survival of the land. But now here their people are called upon again to be examples in the struggle, in the fight for humanity. Let me just go to the next slide real quick. But not only building solidarity within the U.S., but again, carrying it to COP. The thing I want to mention about the past COP was the first time they held a COP in a major failed state. Egypt is not a democracy. And it's not an accident that it was held there, because they were negotiating the financial side of COP. And that COP 27 had the largest number of fossil fuel funded activists and lobbyists at that event and venue. And the NGO side, because it was in a failed state, the ability to organize and protest like they did in Glasgow. They shut down Glasgow on COP 26. But because they were in a dictatorship state, they had to register a week in advance before they could hold a protest. And even then, it could only be within this place and space. And so even the word getting out was only mainly through social media. But it shows you what happens when you try to do the globe's business in a failed state. And it wasn't an accident. Because some said, well, they had to have one in Africa. Well, they could have had it in South Africa, which is a functioning democracy, which still would have allowed for protests. And also the global message of frontline communities and voices. And they're going to do it again next year in another failed state. it's over in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. I think it's the United Arab Emirates for COP20. I may be wrong. Somebody can check that on the internet for me. But the point of the matter is the fact that the most critical aspects of the global climate fight is being held in failed states that are anti-democratic, anti-women, is a very, very, very significant sign, and it doesn't get us to the place and space to really build the global climate. I'm getting a hook. Movement. Next slide. But that's why fighting, mobilizing, movement building, next slide. Fighting for the core principles of just transition, but workforce development. Okay, this is a critical aspect, what I love about this FISU conference, but also lifting up Chippy for the workforce, $40 million, green fund, a critical fund that's going to be investing in jobs from the Canadian border in the first Mohawk Nations all the way down to the New York Harbor. Next job. But again, taking the voice of the powerless to frontline, to international and global action. So I arranged at that time at COP15 for the largest delegation of union and educators to speak at COP15. Next slide. But also lifting up the voice of frontline communities like the indigenous people that are on the Bikini Atoll. We were first in the 1940s using it for testing bombs, and today you can look at, they're now dealing the islands, they're losing their islands to ocean rise. Next slide. And so the issue is right now within the movement, when we talk about saving winter, we must deal with the lackluster aspect with regards to diversity. Now, amongst the FISU delegation, you can see the FISU World University Games, we have an international community and people of color that are part of it. But it now needs to also, as I say, give the opportunity to connect that effort to all efforts. And as I say, giving the global platform that is needed for athletes who, A, are losing winter, but where can they speak up at? What can they connect to? Movements like our movement that we're doing with the Adirondack Council, next slide. Next slide. Is what we seek to do. So what we're trying to do is moving paths forward to the solutions, and I'll just cut right to the bottom, is building that movement by building that grassroots action. Again, I have those little QR codes that are there if you want to sign up or engage the movement and how to be a part of the action of the Forever Adirondacks campaign, you can do so. Let me, next slide, next slide, next slide. And this is why it's important. Bill McKibben mentioned the People's Climate March. This was another investment under my watch as past Sierra Club national president, was investing in making sure that the frontline diverse communities of color were at the front lines in the fight, because it is these communities. This is what the world that's right now going to face the worst effects. Yes, we're losing winter, but to them, they've already lost their equivalent of winter. Now they're losing their homes. There are now the climate refugees that are showing up at our southern borders, which we're now trying to paint as the most ugly and vile racism, instead of dealing humanely with human migration that's a direct result of climate change. We can find our humanity, we can save this planet, but we must engage so and do so justly. We must have holistic relationships. Right now, I gave a talk at Nodge Church, and he said, well, what do you think of the Adirondacks? I said, it is right now the Noah's Ark. It is one of those few green arcs around the globe that we have the chance to save humanity, the chance to save biodiversity. And I enlist all of you, listening abroad, actively, athletes, using your voice, using your platform to lift up the fight for the trees, for the forest, for the carbon sink, for all those things that are wild, for the biodiversity, because they do not speak for themselves, but we do. And now more than ever, our existence depends on us actively defending all creation. Last slide. Last slide, next slide. I talked about the impact on my daughters. This is Marjana. She's now, I think this fall she'll be a lieutenant colonel, first female infantry commander in the United States Army. And she's an engineer. Because of her exposure, because of her experience, she is working still to this day using her expertise and knowledge to protect humanity. And as we know what's happening over in Ukraine, God forbid, she is also an advocate, passionate defender of the rights of all free people to be determined to be free. So I want to thank you all for listening and lending me your ear this morning and time. I did run a little bit over, and I ask that if we can just give them at least one or maybe one or two questions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mair. So we will take one question, and I'd like to introduce Ms. Maria Bulatova, the FISU Education Committee member representing Ukraine. Glad to have you here this morning with us. And we'll just take one question, and then for those of you in the audience and for those of you watching via the live stream, if you can send your other questions into the Whova app, then we will try our best to get those answered there. Ms. Bulatova?
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me speak like that. So, Aaron, we appreciate to your 40 years fight. And you did today an amazing presentation. I was listening to you and catching every word and thinking about your life. So it's one of the examples of good living. You should be proud of yourself. Your daughter should be proud of yourself. Your family and your country should be proud to have such a people, and you are. I would like to say that being in the modern world and not talking about the problems what we have, it's not fair. I'm Ukrainian. I'm Vice President of the National Olympic Committee, working for the IOC Culture and Heritage Committee. I'm the Olympic historian, and I would like to say many, many words which are connected with Lake Placid, but we do not have too much time. And I would like, using that I have a microphone, just put one question to Aaron and ask him, do you know that everybody in the audience know what's happening in my country, in Ukraine? So it's bombing, people are killed, the environment is in terrible situation. We have 15 nuclear working stations, and it's under control. So it could be anything you can imagine or can't imagine. So we have polluted our air, our earth is polluted, and our water is polluted. And we are in the center of Europe. But my question is, are you ready to contact with us and consult us what to do with our country when the war stops?
Let me be clear. You have my solidarity. As Brother McKibben pointed, that fascism is one of the greatest disasters to the environment and humanity. The fact that the terms, just like any racism, calling your people Nazis and using that as a way of delegitimizing your humanity is not, as they say, it's not an accident, it's a feature of fascism. And Absolutely. It is also anchored in the core. It's a fossil fuel state destroying, another country so that it can maintain its global hegemony and expand its markets. It did bribe a lot of democracies into silence. And sadly, a number of developing nations, because of their energy vulnerability, are sadly siding with them, not out of morality, but out of fear. And we cannot live in fear. We cannot fear, as Bill said, the worst effects of climate change and what's going to happen. It should give us and inspire us to action. And right now, it was an honor and a beautiful thing to see the athletes in their resilience, despite their moms, their dads, their brothers, their sisters losing their lives and being impacted. But they still come to show their humanity through sport and solidarity. And I pray that all lift that up as an example of hope and all what we must live and do to save this planet and protect it from the worst effects of climate change, but also fossil fuel fascism that's financing the threat and the destruction of Ukraine. Slava Ukrainia.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. My dear friends, as I know, we had several questions on the chat, and we have 2 questions from the audience. I would like to give the floor to the people who would like to ask. Oh, no. So, okay. I am not, if I have the microphone, so I have to say a few words, if you allow me, because I know that we are on time limit. I would like to say you that yesterday I visited the Olympic Museum in Lake Placid. It was a great pleasure for me because I'm an Olympic historian and I see everything what's happened with this small village twice in the history in 32 and in 1980. And it was a big risk for the Olympic movement to give the Olympic Games of 1932 to the small village who nobody knows. You know, the first two Winter Olympic editions were in Chamonix, and in St. Moritz is the best fashionable resort of Europe. And then we know that this small village just appeared on the map of the winter sport just in 1920. And it was a big risk, but you know, the economical crisis in Europe and the United States, but people came here, and it was a tremendous, great games. But what I see in the Olympic Museum yesterday, it was the Olympic podium, no signs, and nobody knows about it. And I use the opportunity that I'm having the microphone. I would like to say it was a tremendous thing in the Olympic history what's happened here in Lake Placid that time in 1932. First time in the Olympic history, the athlete was invited to the Olympic podium. Before all the Olympic Games, the VIP person was standing in the podium, and the athletes came to them to receive the medal. But in 32, in Lake Placid, in this place, it was first in the Olympic history that the athlete was appreciated to stand on the podium, and the VIPs are coming to him and ordering him his medal. But no signs in the museum. That's why it's my privilege to say that to the people if they don't know. So the democracy started from here, the Olympic democracy. Thank you very much for being patient to us with Aaron. Aaron, thank you once again. Thank you, thank you. So we are continuing our